Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 405. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to talk about today: Venezuela, Korea, Russia, China, particularly NATO expansion. Finland is officially the 31st member of the alliance. So we'll be breaking down what that means and a lot of other news on today's show. Just share the show if you can. You can find it at the Libertarian Institute, on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up everywhere you can listen to podcasts. If there's somewhere you typically listen to podcasts and you can't find or you can't find conflicts of interest there, please let me know and I will get it up there. You can also share the show from my Twitter account. I post everything there, all the articles I write, everything I do, con_interest for the show, and then I am Kyle Anzalone _. And with that, let's get into the news today. First up, Venezuela's opposition envoy calls for Biden to ease sanctions. Fernando Bassi, an envoy for Venezuela's U.S.-backed opposition, is calling on the Biden administration to ease crippling sanctions on Venezuela, saying not doing so could turn the country into another Cuba, which has been under a U.S. trade embargo since 1962. If we continue down this path, Venezuela is destined to be another Cuba, he said. It will become an issue for politicians in Florida to win elections. That would be an extremely sad destiny for this country. He said sanctions relief could provide much needed relief for ordinary Venezuelans and incentivize President Nicolas Maduro to make concessions to the opposition related to the upcoming 2024 election. He said, "We have now begun with a coherent plan whereby we give something and the government reciprocates." His position is a departure from the opposition, what the opposition wanted when it was led by Juan Guaido, who declared himself interim president of Venezuela in 2019. Guaido was backed by the United States and favored foreign intervention and crippling sanctions on his country, losing him what little support he had. Also important to note that Guaido got access to a lot of funds from the United States, but also a lot of Venezuelan money that's held overseas. So while he was demanding these crippling sanctions, he himself was not suffering financially. At the end of 2022, the U.S.-backed opposition voted to remove Guaido as the interim president and dissolve the interim government, which has never had any real power besides access to some Venezuela offshore assets and foreign embassies. I should add here, they had foreign power not in Venezuela, but when it came to the U.S., and of course the U.S. has a lot of power over Venezuela, so, they were able to, Guaido was a very important figure to what was happening in Venezuela, even if he never held any real power in the country. This is a guy that held so little power that despite the fact that he had declared himself in a coup against the government, they, for the most part, just let him run around because, he was just so inconsequential and so unable to generate any real opposition towards the government. I guess Maduro figured it would be a bigger deal to arrest him and then, face the international consequences versus just letting him continue to mouth off within the country when he was there. All right, so next up, I wrote this article for the Libertarian Institute on April 3rd. U.S. opens war games with Japan, South Korea, provoking North Korean threats. Washington has kicked off anti-submarine drills off the coast of Korea with Seoul and Tokyo. The naval maneuvers have provoked Pyongyang to issue a warning that it could use nuclear weapons. The two-day military exercises are being led by the USS Nimitz, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. The vessel was already in the region for the Full Eagle War Games with South Korea, the largest ever live-fire military drills the peninsula has seen in 5 years. The North Korea DPRK said the Full Eagle drills, which ran from March 13th to the 23rd, pushed tensions so high that nuclear war was a realistic possibility, and later carried out weapons tests in retaliation. The current anti-submarine exercises began on the heels of Full Eagle and prompted a sharp reboot from Pyongyang through an editorial in its state-run Korean Central News Agency, that's the KCNA. And this is from the statement in KCNA. The U.S. and its followers should never forget that the fact that their rival state has possessed the nuclear attack capability in practice, as well as characteristics of the people and army of the DPRK, which do not make empty talk. The article added it would be quite clear how DPRK's nukes will be used if the deterrence does not work on those who are running amok. A statement from the South Korean military said the drills would improve the three countries' ability to detect, track, and destroy North Korean underwater threats. A Japanese official said the exercises are meant to promote trilateral cooperation to deal with regional security concerns, protect our shared security interests, and prosperity, to show the three countries' commitment to strengthening the rules-based international order. So I want to take a detour from my article for just 1 second to point out how I think significant it is that Japan in particular is being included in these war games. You know, for a long time, South Korea has not had a very good relationship with Japan, despite the fact that both of these countries are heavily within the American orbit, and this is because of the treatment of the Koreans by Imperial Japan during World War II. And then, you know, after that, the Japanese government was very hesitant to recognize those crimes and to provide any I guess from the Korean perspective, certainly any kind of fair compensation to the victims. And so, you know, these deals are still being hashed out. I think the U.S. has really been leaning on Seoul, in particular, the new president there, Yoon, to agree to a deal with Japan to, you know, kind of move past these issues. I guess I don't know enough to say what the U.S. is pushing is fair or not. I understand that it has received some backlash in South Korea. So my guess is, you know, the South Koreans generally feel like their government is kind of selling them out here. You know, South Korea hasn't had a good relationship with Japan. You imagine that North Korea, who suffered that same occupation, war crimes, you know, that the comfort women taking South Korean women and using them as sex slaves for the our Korean women, not South or North Korean women. Back then, it was just the whole Korean peninsula as its own entity under Imperial Japan. So taking the Korean women and using them as sex slaves, taking the Korean men, using them as, you know, just labor slaves. And, you know, so North Korea in particular responds very sharply when the U.S. does things with Japan and South Korea in a trilateral method. In fact, during I believe it was the 2022 NATO summit in Madrid, we had the U.S. on the sidelines there sign a trilateral pact with South Korea and Japan to increase defense ties, and North Korea denounced that as the U.S. trying to create a NATO in Asia. So back to the article here. Beijing later slammed the three-way war games, with Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning saying such drills are the main reason for the high tensions on the Korean peninsula, and called on all sides to create favorable conditions for the resumption of dialogue. Tensions on the peninsula are likely to continue to increase as Washington and Seoul announced plans to conduct their largest ever live fire war games in June. This from the South Korean Defense Ministry. The program is designed to showcase the ability of the two nations to materialize peace through strength via action amid stern security situations arising from North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. So this is, you know, really interesting because you had the Chinese position, and that is that, look, carrying out the war games do not create fertile ground for talks on the Korean peninsula. And then we had the you know, case example of Trump, which, you know, for the first year and a half or so of his presidency, threatened North Korea, and North Korea responded by testing more missiles and issuing its own threats. Then Trump took a different approach. He scaled back the militarism on the Korean Peninsula. He engaged Kim Jong-un in talks and sharing of letters, direct bilateral communication between the two leaders. The U.S. suggested that it was willing to not normalize relations with North Korea, but start to improve relations with North Korea without demanding North Korea give up all of its weapons of mass destruction, with North Korea sees as its deterrent to prevent a U.S.-based regime change in Pyongyang. So, back to the article here, Pyongyang has repeatedly condemned U.S.-led military drills on the peninsula as preparations for regime change, and has rejected the Washington's claims that the operations are defensive. And this more from the KCNA editorial. This being a hard fact, those of the defense and State Departments of the U.S. have parroted that the military drills with South Korea are defensive and routine, ones that have lasted for a long time, but they can never conceal with such veils as defensive and routine their aggression colors as provocateurs, and the fact that the current exercises are deliberate military actions prompted by their sinister schemes to wreak peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula. So, this is the view of the war games from North Korea. And, I think it's very important to understand how Pyongyang sees this. Now, the last thing I'll add is we recently had U.S. intelligence officials come out and say that anytime the U.S. carries out war games, North Korea is going to conduct missile tests. So this seemingly, means that somewhere in the Biden administration, somebody knows that carrying out war games is only going to lead to more militarism on the Korean Peninsula and not open up the grounds, the diplomatic fertile grounds we need to engage in talks. All right, let's talk about Ukraine now. Top Republican visits Kiev, says support for arming Ukraine is overwhelming. So we have a bunch of Republicans in Ukraine, and I'll break down what they all said. So House Intelligence Committee Chairman Mike Turner, a Republican from Ohio, traveled to Ukraine on Monday and claimed there remains overwhelming congressional support for providing Kiev with military aid. His remarks appear to contradict the White House's assessment that Congress is not prepared to pass another massive military aid package. During his remarks in Kiev, Turner acknowledged that there is a minority in both parties that desire a debate over further aid to Ukraine. However, he said overwhelmingly there is support for continuing to aid Ukraine so they can continue to fight this aggression of Russia. In January, CIA Director William Burns traveled to Kiev and warned President Volodymyr Zelensky that at some point the aid will be harder to come by. An unnamed advisor to Zelensky told Politico in February, I think both on Capitol Hill and the administration, there are people who are looking to calibrate security assistance to incentivize Ukrainians to cut some sort of deal. I'm afraid. Turner made the trip to Ukraine with three other members of Congress, all Republicans: Chris Stewart from Utah, Rich McCormick from Georgia, and Darren LaHood of Illinois. Stewart claimed that most Americans will support arming Kiev for the long term. He explained most conflicts such as this between nation states take time to resolve themselves. Stewart continued, I think the American people understand that as long as they feel like progress is being made, over being careful with money and being thoughtful on how we involve U.S. resources. So the Stewart comment is really interesting because if you look at the actual situation in Ukraine, none of his metrics are being met. Ukraine is losing territory all the time. They don't have the resources to mount a counter-offensive, so it doesn't seem like at any point in the near future that there is going to be something in Ukraine that resembles progress towards winning this war. As far as being careful with money and being thoughtful for how we involve U.S. resources, I think we've seen the lack of oversight in Congress and the fact that there's no will in Congress whatsoever. And to pass a bill that says that we're going to have an inspector general keep track of this $100 billion plus that we're sending to Ukraine, that means that there's probably not being very careful with our money. And I think a lot of Americans actually know that. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was also in Ukraine on Monday, although I believe this was like a separate event. It wasn't organized with the congressman. The ex-CIA director and also Secretary of State explained that the American leader will continue to support Kiev as long as it does not require American soldiers to fight in the country, saying he hasn't asked for our young men and women. So as long as we stay in that place, Pompeo said, I am convinced most American leaders will see it that as we will continue to support the efforts. And so, this is what I've been saying all along, that the U.S. is willing to fight Russia in Ukraine to the last Ukrainian. They don't want to send Americans to fight and die in that country. However, as long as they can assess in Washington that they are weakening Russia, whatever that means, then they're willing to continue to give Kiev at least as much aid as needed to incentivize its leaders not to make a deal with Russia and rather to keep this war going. Because again, they see, maybe it's weakening Ukraine a lot more, it's hurting Ukraine a lot more, but they don't care about Ukraine. They just care about weakening Russia. All right, we have official NATO expansion here. Finland formally joins NATO, doubling the alliance's border with Russia. Finland formally became the 31st member of NATO on Tuesday, officially ending the country's post-World War II policy of neutrality and raising tensions between Helsinki and Moscow. The Finnish presidency said in a statement, Finland has today become a member of the defense alliance NATO. The era of non-alignment in our history has come to an end. A new era begins. The ascension into NATO was completed during a ceremony attended by the Finnish foreign minister and our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, as well as NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Finland joining NATO more than doubles the alliance's territory that borders Russia. Moscow said it will respond by beefing up its military presence in the region and will take more measures if other NATO countries deploy military assets to Finnish countries. And this has been the Russian statement all along. A lot of people who I don't think understand the geopolitical situation in Europe kind of say, well, look how big of a loss the war in Ukraine is for Russia because it drove Finland to join NATO, and that puts another massive country on Russia's border that's a member of NATO. And they see, okay, well, Russia didn't want Ukraine in NATO, and so they don't want Finland in NATO. I'm sure Russia doesn't want NATO expansion, but from the Russian position, there's a huge difference between Finland and Ukraine, where Ukraine is historically has very close ties to Moscow, if not at times being the same state. The number of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, their persecution by the government in Kiev, particularly since 2014, and also the strategic, position between the Ukrainian border and Moscow means that, for Russia, Ukraine, Georgia joining NATO are real red lines, where Finland joining NATO, while not desired, I don't think is the same thing. And then, of course, you also have Russia saying that, look, as long as there's not a major NATO military presence in Finland, then it's not going to be a big deal. My guess is that is going to happen, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, over the next year or so. Next up, Washington Post, officials at NATO meeting know not to talk about Nordstrom bombings. The Washington Post reported on Monday that some Western officials are not eager to find out who was behind the bombings of the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines that connect Russia and Germany. An unnamed senior European diplomat told the Post that there is an understanding at gatherings of European and NATO policy members don't talk about Nord Stream. The report says leaders see little benefit from digging too deeply and finding an uncomfortable answer, the diplomat said, echoing sentiments of several peers in other countries who said they would rather not have to deal with the possibility that Ukraine or allies were involved. So this is astounding. Of course, everybody knows, and we talked about on the show so much, Seymour Hersh's great reporting that came out in February, pointing to the U.S. as being behind this. But this certainly confirms that it definitely was a Western country that did this. Because if they thought there was even a hint of a possibility that they could blame this on Russia, this would be talked about every day, not downplayed. So Russia is officially blaming Ukraine for the terror bombing that killed a Russian journalist in St. Petersburg. I broke this down on the last show, so I'm not going to get too much into it on today's show. I just, wanted to point out that this is what Russia is saying. We have Daria Dugina, same situation. So my guess is that this is going to probably escalate tensions between Russia and Ukraine, but unless something more comes of this, my guess is it's not going to be any kind of significant escalation here. So let's move on. The Russian mercenary group Wagner raises its flag over the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. The head of Russia's Wagner group said Sunday that his forces had raised the Russian flag over the city hall in Bakhmut, but the battle still rages as Ukrainian forces still control some of the western districts of the Donbass city. So Russia seems to be picking up territory in Bakhmut, maybe slightly faster over the past week or so. Maybe this is just kind of strategic, where Ukraine's pulling back to maybe some more defensible areas in the city or around the city. I expect fighting to go on here for some time, as I guess Ukraine will probably try a couple times to retake the city as much as they have invested in it, and then kind of see what they could do. I'm not sure if a Ukrainian counteroffensive is possible, and at this point, given the way the war is going, it seems unlikely to be effective and successful. But at the same time, the fighting here is going to continue, at least I would guess, for the coming weeks, as Russia kind of cleans up and takes control of the districts surrounding Bakhmut. All right, the U.S. is announcing a new $2.6 billion weapons package for Kiev. This is interesting as Bakhmut is falling. Something Ukrainian officials said could signal the time for them to start to negotiate with Russia. We have another massive influx of American weapons going to Ukraine. This includes additional munitions for Patriot air defense systems, additional ammunition for HIMARS, 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds, 120 millimeter mortar rounds, 120 millimeter and 105 millimeter tank ammunition, 25 millimeter ammunition, tube launched optically tracked wire guided tow missiles. Those are anti-tank missiles, approximately 4,000 grenade launchers and 200,000 rounds of ammunition, 11 tactical vehicles to recover equipment, 61 heavy fuel tankers, 10 trucks and trailers to transport heavy equipment, testing and diagnostic equipment to support maintenance and repair, spare parts, and other field equipment. The equipment that will be purchased, so that these are the weapons that are going to Ukraine under the Presidential Drawdown Authority. These are just things that Biden is sending out of the U.S. stockpiles straight to Ukraine. Now, we also have this USAI. It's a fund that the president has, and they can purchase weapons from contractors rather than just American stockpiles. So and this includes additional munitions for the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems. These are anti-aircraft systems that Ukraine has been using. 9 counter-unmanned aerial systems, 30 millimeter gun trots, 10 mobile CUAS laser-guided rocket systems, 3 air surveillance radars, 30 millimeter and 23 millimeter anti-aircraft ammunition, 130 millimeter and 122 millimeter artillery rounds, 102 millimeter Grad rockets, rocket launchers and ammunition, 120 millimeter and 81 millimeter mortar systems, and then rounds for those mortar systems, 120 millimeter tank ammunition, Javelin anti-armor systems, anti-armor rockets, precision aerial munitions, approximately 3,600 small arms and more than 23 million rounds of small arm ammunition, several tactical vehicles to recover equipment, 8 heavy fuel tankers, and 105 fuel trailers, armored bridging systems, 4 logistics support vehicles, trucks, and 10 trailers to transport heavy equipment, secure communications equipment, SATCOM terminal services, funding for training, maintenance, and sustainment. So that's a lot of money. That's a lot of weapons that are going to Kiev. And again, I think the plan here is to make sure the Ukrainian government keeps fighting even though they're losing the war. We have it official now. The first batch of Polish MiG-29 fighter jets have arrived in Ukraine. I'm very confused on how this is going to work, and I wonder how much time that these warplanes are actually going to spend, say, on the ground in Ukraine. I wonder if they're going to be taking off from Ukraine. Are they going to land in if they're going to take off from Poland, are they going to land in Ukraine? Are they going to maybe fly a mission over Ukrainian airspace and then either return to Poland or maybe land in Ukraine once or twice before returning to Poland to do some work on these planes? But this is, I think, pretty concerning that these warplanes are going to Kiev and could elicit a major escalation in this war. All right, last story today. This will likely, I think, be the big story that I'm talking about on Friday. McCarthy to host Taiwanese president on Wednesday, risking a Chinese response. So, I've already broken this down. The Taiwanese president is going to stop in California. While there, she's going to meet with Kevin McCarthy, who's the House Speaker. He's from California. And of course, when Nancy Pelosi last year met with President Tai in Taipei, a huge Chinese response. My guess is that China isn't going to give as big of a response to this as they did Pelosi's visit, but we're going to still see war games carried out around Taiwan, and potentially going back to like simulating the blockade of the island or something like that. But we will find out later this week. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show. One more show later this week, and yeah, that's it. Share the show. Anything you do to help out, appreciate it.